Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 12 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Well, if you've been following along with the podcasts up through this current episode number 12, you've seen that what I've been doing is alternating back and forth between some of my favorite great master photographers and some of my personal photographs. And if you've followed along with my personal photographs, you know that I've been involved in photographing in Italy for a long period of time now, 16 years, and I'm about to return this summer for yet another trip. And a question that I think should be answered at this point is we've talked about how we deal with the photographic subject and the idea of the creative impulse, but we haven't really discussed where that creative impulse comes from. How is it that I've been intrigued by photographing in Italy for all this long period of time, and what is it about this subject that continues to attract me and continues to draw me in as an image maker? And I think really it's that impulse that we need to address as photographers, that impulse of why we do things, how we do things, what makes us tick in a way. So, what I'd like to do with this episode of Camera Position is spend a little bit of time looking at my background of my motivation of photographing my chosen subject, the peninsula of Italy, and where that came from and how it's evolved over time, and use a couple of example photographs to explain where I've come to in that idea. When I first started photographing in Italy in 1989, I will certainly admit that my initial impulse was to react as uh, millions of tourists over thousands of years have reacted upon seeing Italy's beauty. I was awestruck by the beautiful architecture, by sculpture, by art, by generally the Italian way of life, and reacted photographically by making pretty pictures of the pretty things that I found there. Over time, though, I began to discover that as I went back again and again, that it was more than just the beautiful things that I saw in Italy. There was, in my mind, as I looked more carefully, a real concerted effort to make of the environment something that was more than it was when the sculptor or the architect started. There was this interest in a vernacular expression, an expression that rose up out of the landscape that was before them to manipulate and mediate that landscape in a certain way, whether it was through an architectural building or whether it was through a farm field that was used to grow grapes or wheat or some other farm product. What was happening was that the keepers of the landscape, the keepers of the cities, the keepers of the towns, were paying very careful attention to what it was that they found, what it was that they saw, and how they felt about those things. And what I began to discover was that what at one point to me in my early years of traveling to Italy looked like this pristine, untouched landscape, really I discovered was a completely mediated landscape. That the architecture, the feeling of the land, the way the land was used, had been used for thousands of years in that way, and that ultimately it was the hands of the people that had done this work, that had created these unbelievably beautiful sculptures and incredibly beautiful buildings, that motivated me. And so what occurred was that over time, my focus, which initially was on everything pretty or beautiful that I saw, began to narrow quite significantly. It became less about being the tourist with the camera, albeit a tourist with a 4 by 5 inch Deerdorf camera, but a tourist with a camera to being somebody who was looking very carefully at the way in which the interaction of structure, land, light, time, and the hands of thousands of years of people who had manipulated these spaces all interacted in a certain way. And so what I wound up with was a body of work that I continue to work on that is more about the way in which people dealt with their own personal space. and did it in a way that was so incredibly personal, but also often incredibly spiritual. Certainly, many of the buildings that I am drawn to are buildings of religious import. Certainly, many of the buildings are also buildings of political importance, where the townspeople or the noble people of a town 3, 4, or 500 years ago gathered to do their business and conduct their political lives. And oftentimes it is the intersection of that secular and religious world that moves me to photograph. But ultimately, it is the idea of light falling on stone, light falling on land, and that care that people took to make a beautiful place even more beautiful by mediating their environment. And it causes me, of course, to think about my own personal environment, living where I live in suburban America, and the way in which we don't seem to really care too much about mediating our landscape and expressing ourselves in a vernacular way in the midst of that landscape. Um, in more recent years, I've been looking at the idea of portraiture, taking the notion of these people's hands to an even greater extent and actually including people. The initial photographs were much more motivated toward the idea of a people-less landscape in an effort to make the pictures have a real timeless feel to them. One of my goals has always been to make photographs that look as though they could have been made any time within the last, 100 years or so. So what began as a sort of casual vacation project has turned into something that is quite a bit more and has quite a bit more depth. And that, I think, is really the point that I wanted to make in this podcast, is that it is that idea of where our inspiration comes from. What is it that we like? What is it that we love? What is it that we find ourselves involved in a variety of different ways in our lives? Too often, I think photographers go out in search of interesting photographs without really thinking too terribly much about what it is that they are interested in. I have become a tremendously interested temporary citizen of Italy, someone who is fascinated by the art, the culture, the churches, the landscape, the people, the way the people live their lives. The entire aspect of the country has become a fascinating prospect for me in so many different ways. So, what I'm trying to get at is that if, as a photographer, you feel like you struggle for subject matter, take a look inside yourself and think about what is it that you couldn't live without? Where is it you couldn't avoid going to if you tried? Who is it that you love the most in the world? How is it that you express those affections and interests? And see if those things can become fodder for your camera's lens and your time as a photographer. Before I close for today's podcast, I did want to share a couple of mails that I have gotten. Just always interested in hearing from people out there. And a number of you have written in recently. Keith, and I'm going to mispronounce your name, Keith, I know, Lutit. Keith Lutit, an Australian expat living in Singapore, a serious amateur photographer who is enjoying the podcast. He says he's a perfectionist, so he'll always be a beginner in his mind. And certainly perfectionism is a big part of the photographic world. So thanks, Keith, for writing. I really appreciate your time. And I also got a nice note from Tim Bischoff from Kansas. And Tim wrote and said that he was wanted to write and tell me what a great job he feels that I'm doing on the podcast. Thanks so much, Tim. And he's been looking for just this type of podcast that's more about creative than all the technical stuff. He's a commercial and fine art photographer. And thanks, Tim. That is, in fact, what I'm trying to do here is look at the creative side of photography and talk about what motivates us, how we do what we do, why we do what we do. And I thank you for listening. And I would encourage any of the rest of you who are out there listening and are enjoying the podcast, would like to see certain things or see less of certain things or more of certain things. Several of you have written in and asked that I do them more often. And I actually apologize for the delay in getting this podcast out this week. I was a little under the weather. Don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but you didn't want to hear me a couple of days ago. I think I'm a little lower than I normally am now. So turn down turn down your bass this week. But I'm on the mend, and I appreciate you listening. Send me a note at jeff@jeffcurto.com and go make some photographs. Find out what it is inside of you that calls you to be interested in something, to love something, to be motivated beyond compare, and make that the subject of your photographic life. Thanks, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Camera Position, the podcast about the creative side of photography.